The air in the apostolic palace was thick, heavy with history, authority, and the unmistakable scent of aged marble and polished brass. Outside, the sounds of Rome were muffled, but inside, in the private chamber reserved for the most solemn meetings, the silence was absolute. This was the Vatican, the heart of an ancient faith, and at its center sat Pope Leo XIV. He was a man of towering intellect, known throughout Europe, not just as the spiritual shepherd of the Church, but as a formidable theologian. His eyes, though aged, missed nothing, and his posture, even when seated, commanded the respect of every cardinal, bishop, and Swiss guard within the room. And yet, this particular audience had brought attention no political crisis or theological dispute ever could, because Pope Leo XIV was granting a private audience to a boy named Elias, no older than 8 years, standing small and utterly alone before the Vicar of Christ. He wasn't dressed in finery. He wore the simple, threadbare clothes of a child from the city's poorest district. The contrast was startling, the dazzling gold-threaded papal robes against the humble wool of the boy. The imposing armored Swiss guards, men built like fortresses, stood on either side of the heavy oak doors, their faces unreadable. Though even they seemed to hold their breath, the silence was almost unbearable. Everyone expected Elias to be terrified, to tremble, to perhaps even weep under the immense pressure of the setting. But he didn't. He looked at the Holy Father with an unwavering gaze that held not defiance, but deep, quiet conviction. The Pope leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the ornately carved wooden arms of his throne. He had summoned this child, or more accurately, the boy had managed to bypass layers of cynical bureaucracy with a direct appeal so compelling, so audacious, that the Pope himself had demanded he be brought in. Elias wasn't here to beg for a favor. He wasn't here to ask for a blessing. He was here, as his brief, shocking letter had stated, to present the Holy Father with a challenge rooted not in politics or history, but in a simple, profound truth found in the Holy Bible. Elias held nothing but an old, well-worn, leather-bound volume, a copy of the Scriptures. What question could an 8-year-old child possess that required the immediate, personal attention of the most powerful spiritual leader in the world? What truth could he possibly reveal that the Supreme Pontiff himself did not already know? The mystery hung heavy, demanding an answer that promised to shake the very foundations of every belief held by the men standing watch. This was more than an audience. It was a confrontation between simple faith and absolute authority. But before we dive in, tell me where you're watching us from, and may God bless you wherever you are. Now let's begin. Pope Leo XIV broke the profound silence. His voice, usually powerful enough to fill St. Peter's Basilica, was softened, almost gentle, yet it carried the weight of his office. "Elias," he began, "you have impressed me greatly just by reaching this room. Now speak the matter that brings you here. Do not fear the surroundings, nor the men around us. Speak the truth as your heart knows it." Elias took a deep breath. His eyes didn't dart away. They remained fixed on the Pope. He wasn't addressing a king or a political figure. He was speaking to a shepherd about his flock. He opened the old Bible, his small fingers resting on a certain passage, though he never looked down at the words. He knew them by heart. "Holy Father," the boy's voice began, surprisingly clear and steady, echoing slightly against the high vaulted ceiling. "The Scriptures teach us that when a man is hungry, he should be fed. When he is weak, he should be lifted up. But I have a question about the man who is judged." He paused, letting the words sink in. The elderly cardinal on the left shifted uncomfortably. "The Bible speaks of justice, and it speaks of mercy. But I have been taught that if the man who is hungry steals a small loaf of bread to feed his starving sister, the justice of the law condemns him. Yet the mercy of God should save him." Elias stepped closer, a step that in this grand room felt like an immense journey. "My question, Holy Father, is this. When the Church itself is faced with such a choice, to uphold the established, written law of man, or to choose the immediate, living mercy of God, which path is the true path of Christ? Do we punish the desperate for their small theft, or do we challenge the system that allowed them to starve in the first place?" The question hung in the air, a spiritual thunderclap. It wasn't a theological riddle for scholars to debate. It was a profound moral paradox, rooted in the daily suffering of the poor, a suffering the wealthy Church often seemed distant from. Elias wasn't asking about dogma. He was asking about action. Pope Leo XIV was momentarily stunned. This was not the simple query of a student. This was a challenge to the established order, an almost revolutionary demand for prioritization. In his 30 years as Pope, he had never faced a question that so cleanly sliced through the layers of doctrine and protocol to expose the raw, beating heart of faith. The boy's question, though phrased simply, indicted centuries of institutionalized caution and comfort. The Holy Father leaned back, his brilliant mind racing. The very principles of canon law and the management of a vast institution often demanded adherence to the written rule. But this child spoke of the spirit of the law. He spoke of the injustice against the vulnerable, the man who steals because he is abandoned, not because he is inherently evil. The Pope had built his legacy on powerful, articulate defenses of the faith. But for this moment, he had no clever counter-argument, no learned citation. He simply gazed at the small boy and the worn Bible, realizing that the simplest truths are often the hardest to face. As the Pope remained silent, processing the profound implication of Elias's question, the cardinals surrounding the throne began to stir. They couldn't allow such a dangerous line of inquiry to continue unchallenged. For them, this was no matter of spiritual dilemma. It was a breach of protocol and an insult to authority. Cardinal Domenico, a man whose life revolved around the precision of canon law, stepped forward, his voice tight with barely concealed irritation. "Holy Father, with all due respect, this is a distraction. The boy speaks from mere sentiment, not theological training. His question is predicated on a fallacy, that law and mercy are mutually exclusive. The law upholds order. Mercy is applied within that order. We cannot permit a child to—" Elias turned, not towards the cardinal, but towards the crucifix hanging high on the wall. He interrupted Cardinal Domenico not with disrespect, but with an authority drawn directly from the scriptures themselves. "Sir," Elias said, his voice ringing with newfound confidence, "the Gospel of Matthew says, 'I desire mercy, and not sacrifice.' And the Apostle James tells us that mercy triumphs over judgment. If the rule of law allows a sister to starve while we debate its limits, then that rule is a sacrifice the Lord does not desire. It becomes a blindfold upon the eyes of justice itself." A collective gasp, quickly suppressed, rippled through the chamber. Elias hadn't just quoted scripture. He had used it as a surgical tool to dissect the cardinal's argument. The elderly churchman, caught off guard by the boy's unexpected fluency and precision, stammered, unable to immediately conjure a rebuttal. Pope Leo XIV held up a hand, a slight gesture that was instantly obeyed. He silenced the cardinal without a word. The Pope's expression was no longer one of mere curiosity, but of genuine, deep fascination. He recognized that Elias was not merely reciting rehearsed lines. The boy's eyes held the light of someone who had seen the injustice he described, and found his sole refuge and weapon in the Holy Book. Leo XIV realized the truth. Elias was not here as a spectacle. He was here as a prophet of uncomfortable clarity. The cardinals saw a challenge to their learned authority. The Pope saw a mirror reflecting the Church's own institutionalized spiritual blindness. They had become so consumed with the complexity of their own doctrines that the simplicity of Christ's message, the immediate, overwhelming requirement for compassion, had become obscured, replaced by the self-important defense of their own sophisticated interpretations. The truth spoken by this small, humble child was inconvenient, direct, and entirely undeniable. Pope Leo XIV now understood that he was in the presence of more than just a precocious child. He was being tested by the very spirit of humility. To test the true source of Elias's conviction, the Pope decided to move beyond mere quotation and probe the boy's spiritual discernment. "Elias," the Holy Father said, his voice soft yet commanding, "your defense of mercy is commendable. But tell me, how can the shepherd protect the entire flock if he constantly breaks the fences? Order must be maintained. If every desperate act is excused, the whole structure collapses into chaos, and the many suffer for the few. Give me a clear sign of how to reconcile the need for order with the command for immediate mercy." The chamber held its breath again. This was a challenge that stumped even seasoned legal minds. Elias did not look to his Bible this time. He looked straight into the Pope's eyes and smiled a small, innocent smile that seemed entirely out of place in such a solemn room. "Holy Father," Elias replied, "the shepherd who builds fences is wise, but the shepherd who watches his sheep starve outside the fence, even while he debates the proper height and spacing of the wood, is a fool. His fence is not a protection. It is a prison." He then continued with an analogy that instantly drew a powerful visual picture in the minds of everyone listening, contrasting sharply with the opulent surroundings. "If a ship is sinking," Elias explained, "the captain does not spend precious moments debating maritime law or who owns the lifeboats. He launches the lifeboats. He saves the lives. The law is the ship. The lives are the people. We rebuild the ship after the people are safe. The greatest failure is to let a soul sink into despair while we protect the empty vessel." The simplicity of the analogy was devastating. It stripped away all the layers of institutional justification, the maritime law of canon law, the ship of the complex Vatican bureaucracy. It put human life and immediate suffering back at the absolute center, exactly where the Gospels insisted they should be. The Pope closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the boy's wisdom. When he opened them, he asked the boy, "Where did you learn such wisdom, Elias? What school taught you this deep truth?" Elias looked down at his worn leather Bible, clutching it tighter. "I did not learn this in a school, Holy Father. My wisdom comes from my grandmother. She taught me to read this book by the light of a single, sputtering lamp in our tiny room. She taught me that the truth of God isn't found in thick commentaries or marble halls, but in the stories of the poor. She always said, 'Little one, the word is simple. Men make it complicated when their hearts are full of silver instead of God.'" The revelation struck the Pope like a physical blow. The simple, humble wisdom of a loving grandmother, passed down in poverty, had exposed a fundamental spiritual flaw in the world's most powerful religious institution. The truth, in all its piercing clarity, was accessible to everyone, yet had been systematically overlooked by those who claimed to guard it. Pope Leo XIV slowly rose from his throne, a move that drew every eye in the room. This was the moment of decision, the ultimate dramatic payoff. Would he dismiss the boy and defend the institution, or embrace the simple truth that had been laid bare? He walked, without the aid of his customary staff, across the expanse of the Persian rug toward the small figure of Elias. The cardinals watched, rigid with apprehension, fearing what their leader was about to do. When the Pope reached Elias, he did something entirely unprecedented. Pope Leo XIV, the spiritual leader of millions across the globe, knelt. He knelt before the 8-year-old boy. The collective shock in the room was electric. The Holy Father, his voice thick with emotion and the weight of his admission, spoke directly to Elias. "My son, your wisdom today is a gift from God. You have shown me where my own eyes, clouded by decades of power and doctrine, have been blind. The ship has been sailing, but we forgot the purpose of the voyage. You have reminded the shepherd to smell the wool, not just count the sheep." The effect of this stunning gesture was immediate and profound. The rigidity melted from the room. Cardinal Domenico, the staunchest defender of protocol, visibly crumbled. His head dropped, his face etched with shame. One by one, the other cardinals followed his lead, lowering their heads, not in obeisance to the Pope, but in profound respect for the simple, unassailable truth spoken by the child. And then came the most astonishing sight of all. The mighty, stone-faced Swiss guards, the paragons of military discipline, shifted their polished halberds to rest on the floor. In a gesture of silent, shared humility, they too bowed their heads. Their metallic helmets glittered in the dim light, but their stance, usually unwavering, was softened by a moment of genuine, shared repentance. The title of the story had been fulfilled. Even the guards bowed their heads to the undeniable power of pure, simple wisdom. The Pope remained kneeling for a long moment, a symbol of absolute authority, humbled by the purity of faith. When he finally stood, he placed his hand gently on Elias's shoulder. "I promise you this, Elias," the Holy Father declared, his voice ringing with a new, sober conviction. "I will not let this truth pass. This day will mark a fundamental change in how we address the forgotten and the judged. The question you brought, of prioritizing immediate mercy over rigid rule, will be re-examined throughout the entire Church, starting now. The power of this office must and will serve the truth you have revealed, not obscure it." Elias, overwhelmed not by the power but by the love in the Pope's eyes, simply nodded, his mission complete. The entire chamber had witnessed a spiritual revolution led by a child, a powerful, dramatic payoff that promised to reshape centuries of tradition. The legacy of Elias, the boy who humbled the Pope, was the profound reawakening of a simple faith. He had proved that wisdom is not exclusive to age, title, or academic degree. The deepest truths were not guarded by the highly learned, but were revealed to the pure of heart. Elias had exposed the dangerous belief that complexity equated to piety, a false doctrine that had allowed the church to become spiritually distant. His story became a guiding light, a clear resolution to the moral dilemma he had presented. Pope Leo XIV, inspired by the child's clarity, began to dismantle the fences that had separated the institution from its mission. He initiated sweeping concrete reforms aimed at increasing transparency and prioritizing direct aid to the urban poor, effectively prioritizing immediate mercy over rigid adherence to institutional law whenever human need was at stake. Elias himself returned to his home, became a quiet hero cherished by his community. His grandmother, the true source of his spiritual discernment, smiled proudly. Her simple, tireless devotion to teaching the scripture, even by the meager light of a sputtering lamp, had changed the world's most powerful institution. She had proven that a character built on love and knowledge is more powerful than any earthly fortress. The great realization was this: the boy had not sought to destroy the church. He had sought to save its soul from the very arrogance that threatened to consume it. He had achieved the ultimate dramatic resolution by causing the mighty to recognize their smallness and by compelling them to return to the foundational principles of their faith. The entire episode served as a powerful, uplifting message to the world, and especially to those in their later years, who often feel their wisdom is discounted. Elias's story proved that your years of experience, your simple, enduring values, and your quiet connection to truth have a power that no amount of modern sophistication can diminish. The boy taught the world that you are never too small, too young, or too old to hold a truth that can change the course of history. It was a final, stunning realization that the difference between being merely religious and being truly faithful is the decision to use your knowledge not to protect yourself, but to fight for those you love. Pope Leo XIV finally saw that the best revenge against the indifference of the world is not destroying those who fail you, but building something so strong, a faith so simple and true, that their failures become entirely irrelevant. Elias and his grandmother proved that when love meets knowledge, miracles can happen, even in the most unlikely places. If this story of justice and overcoming institutional adversity has touched your heart, subscribe to the channel to discover more real stories that prove that the best revenge is not destroying those who hurt you, but building something so great that they could never imagine. What about you? Have you ever had to fight for someone you love against a system that seemed impossible to beat? Leave your own story of determination in the comments, because, as Elias taught us, every child and every adult has more power than they realize when they decide that justice is worth fighting for.